All right, little scholars, welcome back. This is part two of the screencast on the protest over the war in Vietnam. On your guided notes sheet, you want to answer the next two questions, starting with what people or groups of people opposed the war, and then the next question is what methods did they use? The first groups that began to protest the war were mainly student groups. One of the most well-known student groups that formed was Students for a Democratic Society, also known as SDS, which was founded and led by Tom Hayden and Al Haber. This was a campus-based student group that led protest marches, encouraged civil disobedience, and draft evasion. Civil disobedience means disobeying a law, not just to be a punk, or to get something out of it, but to protest the law itself, to protest the injustice of the law. So SDS would stage sit-ins and occupation of student buildings and campus buildings, trespassing, things like that. Not violent crime, but just breaking the law to protest the war. Draft evasion means getting away from the draft, burning your draft card, not reporting for induction, fleeing the country, those kinds of activities. They also organized strikes, student strikes, and activities like that. They organized and led several teach-ins and marches against the war. At teach-ins, students and teachers at campuses around the United States would stage these sit-ins, but instead of just sitting there, they would talk about the war, and the teachers would teach them the facts of the war. They would learn about what was going on in the war. By the end of 1969, SDS was pretty popular in America. They had chapters on 400 campuses all across America, and they were one of the best known student-led groups protesting the war. There's a picture of Tom Hayden leading one of the protest marches, speaking at one of the protest marches. Um, Tom Hayden had a long career as a politician after the war. He was also married to the actress Jane Fonda, who was also a famous Vietnam War protester herself. Um, on April 17, 1965, the Students for Democratic Society, or SDS, led a protest march of 25,000 people in Washington, D.C. And this is in 1965, so this is pretty early in the war. And this is one of their buttons from the march. On October 21st, 1967, a couple years later, 100,000 anti-war protesters demonstrated at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And then later on, 30,000 of those marchers marched to the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. and camped out on the steps of the Pentagon, where they planned an all-night vigil against the war. And several violent clashes between soldiers and the police, federal marshals and military police, broke out. A lot of the protesters were beaten by the military police and the federal marshals. Several of them were injured, several of them were arrested, and this was all covered by the news media and shown on television. So it drew a lot of publicity to the anti-war movement. One of the famous images from this protest is some of the protesters putting flowers in the soldiers' gun barrels. Originally, they had wanted to drop all these flowers on the Pentagon, but the government kind of found out about that, and so they didn't get to do it, but instead they took the flowers and put them in the barrels of the guns. This is an image from that protest at the Pentagon in 1967. Another way that people protested the war was the burning of draft cards and also just trying to get away from the draft. The first draft card burning took place at the University of California at Berkeley in May of 1965. Burning draft cards became a very popular way to make a statement about the war and the draft. Thousands of draftees also fled to Canada or other countries to avoid being drafted. There were, however, some protesters who stayed in the United States and went to prison rather than face service in Vietnam, and that was their own way of making a statement and protesting the draft and the war in general. It's a picture of some people at a protest march burning their draft cards. A second group that began to protest the war were actually the veterans themselves. They formed a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and this was formed in 1967. This was especially damaged to public support for the war. It was one thing to see a bunch of students protesting the war, but it was a whole nother thing to see veterans that had actually been in Vietnam protesting the war and talking about what they had seen and how they were against the war. The veterans would attend protest marches where they would throw away their medals. They would take their uniforms and throw them down on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, and they would give speeches against the war. Some veterans even testified before Congress about atrocities they had witnessed in Vietnam, um, trying to convince Congress to withdraw its support for the war. These are some images of protest marches involving veterans against the war. A lot of the veterans were disabled. They were in wheelchairs, they were on crutches, and of course those images were even more effective. These are some images of the veterans throwing their medals away. This is a picture of John Kerry, who fought in Vietnam and was the first soldier, the first veteran to testify before the Senate committee about the war in Vietnam. He later became and is now the Secretary of State. The third group that you hear a lot about protesting the war were the hippies. And not all war protesters were hippies, obviously, but they kind of became a stereotype for the war protesters. Hippies were a large category of young people involved in the counterculture movement. They rejected authority, societal norms. They embraced a more free lifestyle that sometimes included drugs. And sometimes the association of the anti-war movement with drugs may have actually damaged the movement, especially the impression it left on working class and middle class Americans. There's some hippies doing some sort of sit-in. Peace sign became kind of a famous symbol of resistance to the war and also of hippies. On January 14th, 1967, between 20,000 and 30,000 people took part in what was called the Human Be-In. This is alluding to sit-ins and teach-ins, only they called it the Human Be-In, which was an anti-war event in Golden Gate Park in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco, which was kind of the center of hippie culture. So there was music and speakers and a lot of hippies protesting the war. This is an advertising poster. Famous, I guess he's a philosopher, Timothy Leary. He also did a lot of experimentation with acid and drugs, so he's kind of a hippie guru. He was there. The poet Allen Ginsberg was there. There was music, the Steve Miller Band, all in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. So this is a poster for the Human Be-In. There are people dancing at the Human Be-In in 1967. A very important person who opposed the war was Martin Luther King Jr. In 1967, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. went public with his opposition to the Vietnam War. He opposed the war on moral grounds and argued that African American soldiers were dying in Vietnam at the same time they were being denied their rights in the U.S. He took part in many marches and gave anti-war speeches. I'm going to try to show you here a little piece of one of his speeches. If I can get it to work.
So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and to die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Holland. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools.
So you can kind of tell from that speech what he's saying, that it's really sad that African American soldiers are dying in Vietnam in the name of freedom and rights when they can't really even get those things in the United States. Another person, a famous person who opposed the war, was the heavyweight boxer Muhammad Ali. In 1966, heavyweight boxing champion Muhammad Ali declared himself a conscientious objector. A conscientious objector is a person who refuses to go to war on moral and or religious grounds. He refused to be inducted into the army. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, stripped of his title, and banned from boxing for 3 years. So that's a pretty heavy penalty. But he went to court to be granted conscientious objector status, and he won in court. His conviction was later overturned by the Supreme Court, and his titles were reinstated. During the time that he was battling in court, he traveled around the country speaking out against the Vietnam War and also against racism in America. I'm going to try to show you a little part of that speech as well.
Ali defeated Foley by a knockout in the 7th round. Immediately thereafter, he walked into the teeth of a monumental decision. He was drafted, and then he refused induction on the grounds of his religious convictions on war.
My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some darker people or some poor, hungry people in the mud for big, powerful America and shoot them for what? They never called me nigger. They never lynched me. They never put no dogs on me. They never robbed me of my nationality, raped and killed my mother and father. What, I'm going to shoot them for what? How can I go shoot them? Them little poor little black people, little babies and children and women. How can I shoot them poor people? Just take me to jail.
While fighting imprisonment for his stand, Ali was also stripped of his title, denied a license to fight in the United States, and denied a visa to go overseas to fight. He was in a much tighter financial bind than most were aware of.
I don't want to see the world heavyweight champion driving a Volkswagen, guys in the Cadillacs and making fun of you. So I'm working today, I'm hauling, right? And so one day I had to speak at Canisius. Heard of Canisius? Canisius, Fairleigh Dickinson, C.W. Post. 3 colleges and $1,500 a college. Pretty good money. So I broke my wife's piggy bank. She had about $35 in it. $135. I broke the piggy bank to get gas money to get me to the college. And I got enough gas and food money to get the $4,500, the $1,500 extra. At $45 would hold me, pay gas bills, light bills, till I get to the next college. This went on until the whole mess was over.
Inevitably, students would challenge Ali on his stand and his convictions. Remarkably, Ali more than held his own against students who had a far better formal education than he.
I'm saying you talking about me about some draft, and all of you white boys are breaking your neck to get to Switzerland and Canada and London. I'm not going to help nobody get something my Negroes don't have. If I'm going to die, I'll die now, right here fighting you. If I'm going to die, you my enemy. My enemy is the white people, not Viet Congs or Chinese or Japanese. You my opposer when I want freedom. You my opposer when I want justice. You my opposer when I want equality. You won't even stand up for me in America for my religious beliefs, and you want me to go somewhere and fight, but you won't even stand up for me here at home.
So from that, you get a pretty good idea of how strongly Muhammad Ali was opposed to the Vietnam War. And obviously, there were many, many, many more people, both famous and not famous, who opposed the Vietnam War. And there started to be kind of a whole vocabulary built around the opposition to the Vietnam War. Hawks was the nickname given to supporters of the war, whereas opponents of the war were nicknamed Doves. So you get the Hawks and the Doves, and you still hear people use those nicknames for people who are for any war or against any war. As the war drug on in 1968 and beyond, some of the protests became very violent. Two of the best known examples are the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968, where the Democratic Party was nominating its candidate for president, and a lot of war protesters were there, and the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Daley, vowed that he would keep law and order, that he would crack down on the protesters, and he did. They were beaten by the police, and this was all over the news, all over the television during the Democratic National Convention. And many people think that's what cost the Democrats the 1968 election, which was won by the Republican candidate Richard Nixon. And then, of course, the Kent State shootings in 1970 were protesters protesting at Kent State in Ohio, and some military police fired into the crowd of protesters, and 4 students were killed, 12 students were injured, and of course, again, those photographs and that footage was all over the news. So this is an image from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968 of policemen beating the demonstrators. And this is one of the images, the more famous images from the Kent State shootings. So hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of some of the groups and the type of people and specific people who protested the war, and some of the methods that they used: marches and sit-ins and be-ins and draft card burnings and speeches, things like that. The next to last task that you have is to listen to some of the Vietnam War protest songs. I've listed some of them here, some of the more famous ones that you can find on iTunes or other places, and listen to those and then record some of the lyrics on your guided notes. But there's a lot more out there, songs from the Vietnam era, so see what you can find. If in doubt, ask. But listen to the lyrics and see if they're protesting against the war or if they're just protesting against societal norms in general. That was kind of a big thing for the music of the 1960s and the 1970s as well. Remember also that you need to find and print 3 images, either images from the war itself, images of civilians or soldiers in the war, and then or it could also be images of the Vietnam War protests. Of course, there are lots of videos out there too of the different protest marches that I mentioned in the screencast, so you can find actual footage of the Pentagon protests and the protests in New York City and in Berkeley. So if you really want to see the protesters in action, you can find lots of video footage of those things.